we kicked off a series called When God Doesn't Make Sense. And if we are really honest with one another, my guess would be that most of us would say that there are some things about God that we just don't understand. There are times when life doesn't seem fair, and there are times when God doesn't seem to make sense. Why doesn't he respond in the ways that I think or hope that he would respond? And as I said last week, there are a lot of things about this life that I don't understand. I've taken some flack for it this week, but I'm going to stand by my convictions. I just don't understand why you decorate before Thanksgiving. Give Thanksgiving its time, right? And then the day after, I'm all in. You can ask him in. I love Christmas. I'm excited about it, but let's give Thanksgiving the time that it deserves, right? This is one that frustrates Amanda. I don't understand how I can't stand tomatoes, but I love salsa and ketchup and all that other stuff. I don't understand that, but I can't stand tomatoes, right? I don't understand how some of you can eat your steaks well done. I don't understand that. Some of you are with me on that one. Okay. But here's the big one, and I'm going to have to prepare for some backlash on this one. I'm glad Amanda's not here because she would really, in fact, I'll tell you here in a second. I don't understand how anyone can really enjoy watching the Hallmark Christmas movies. She just told me last night she was watching a Hallmark movie. She's out of town this weekend, and I don't understand it. It's all the same, just different actors. The same story, just different actors, every single one of them. All right. There are a lot of things that I don't understand about this life, and some of those things we can laugh about, but some of those things are really, really hard, aren't they? Like, why is there so much cruelty in the world? Why do our kids have to deal with bullies at school? Why do innocent people suffer? Why do good people suffer at the hands of bad people? Have you ever asked God this question? Why? And as we discovered last week, the prophet Habakkuk was asking some of the same questions nearly 3,000 years ago. Last week, we witnessed Habakkuk unload at God in frustration over the way things are. Things were terrible. There is violence and injustice and destruction and conflict abounding all around him. And he's praying and he's seeking answers and he's looking for help. And it seems like God doesn't care, that God's not listening, that he's not responding. And yet what we can learn from Habakkuk's lament is that God is big enough to handle all of our frustrations and all of our questions and all of our doubts. And we'll see that again this week. It's okay to bring your frustrations to God. In fact, sometimes our greatest spiritual growth comes through those times that we question God and we wrestle with our doubts and our frustrations. So Habakkuk brings his frustrations to God, and God gives him an answer, probably not quite the answer that he was looking for, but God gives him an answer, and he reminds Habakkuk, and in that he's reminding you and me, that he is doing something. Even when it seems as though he's not, we can trust God is active and alive and that he is working things out for our good. That doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. It doesn't mean that it's going to be what we want. But God does have a plan, and God is at work. You know, life doesn't always make sense. But even when you don't understand, you can be confident that God has a plan. So last week I encouraged you, when you're struggling and when God doesn't seem to make sense, I just encourage you to bring those frustrations to God and then be prepared to hear what God has to say, not necessarily what you want to hear. Listen for what God wants to say. Allow your frustrations to bring you closer to God and choose to trust his plan. You may say, I don't get it, I don't understand, but you can still choose to trust God and choose to embrace God and never let go, because no matter what happens, and I can't promise you a better life, but I can promise you this: God will never, ever let go of you. God will not let go of you. Well, this week, we're going to look at God's initial response to Habakkuk's lament at the end of Habakkuk's complaint, and we're left wondering, is God going to respond? And if he does respond, how is he going to respond? And as I alluded to, we kind of began it just a little bit last week. God does respond, but God's response is certainly not what Habakkuk was hoping to hear. So let's take a look at it again together. Habakkuk chapter 1, we're going to read verses 5 through 11 this morning. God responds and he says, Habakkuk, you want an answer? Okay, here's my answer. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwelling places not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose own strength is their God. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, God, once again, we thank you for your word. God, we thank you for the ways that you speak truth to us through your word. And once again this morning, we just submit to you. We submit to your truth. We submit to your word. And God, we just ask that you would speak in the ways, again, that only you can speak through the power of your Spirit. Would you speak into each of us? Help us this morning, God. Open our eyes, our ears, and our hearts to see you, to hear you, but most of all, our prayers that we would know you. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. So God responds to Habakkuk's questions, and he says, I'm raising up the Babylonians. Whoa, hold on. God, you know that's the enemy, right? Like, I'm praying for help, and you're telling me you're going to raise up the enemy. And Habakkuk had to be thinking, what are you doing? What are you doing, God? At first glance, verse 5 sounds like good things are coming. But that phrase, utterly amazed, it can be literally translated as horrify yourselves and be horrified. Horrify yourselves and be horrified. It's a terrifying statement by God. He says, I am going to bring about a work that will horrify you. And you won't even believe it when I tell you. And what he's saying is that even though I'm telling you what I'm about to do, you will not respond in faith. Even though I'm warning the people, I'm trying to get their attention, they will not listen. Remember, we said this last week, God has at this point sent 4 prophets in an attempt to get the people's attention. And now he tells Habakkuk exactly what he's going to do. That should have gotten the attention of the people. These messages that God was giving to the people through the prophets, that should have turned their attention and their hearts back to God. But even though God is warning them, they are not listening. So God is now sending the Babylonians. Now, if you know of study history, you know much about the Babylonians. They were, in this time frame, they were known for their cruelty. They were a vicious and evil nation. They had a swift rise to power, and they did it by ruthlessly sweeping over nations and people with destruction, and they wiped out anybody that got in their way. They didn't care who you were. They didn't care what you did. They weren't just going to come and conquer you. They were going to destroy you. The description alone from God is pretty terrifying. Their horses are faster than your horses, so you can't outrun them. They are more terrifying than hungry wolves when the sun is setting. I've never seen this, but have you seen a movie maybe where the wolves are coming at nighttime and they're beginning to surround their prey? It's a terrifying image. The Babylonians are predators, and they're looking to devour. And God says they will swoop in like an eagle, looking to devour, and they will move through intent on violence. They are a group of people that completely annihilate entire nations. You know, there are people that we come up against that are intimidating, but the people that we really need to be afraid of are those people that have no fear. You know what I mean? The people that are not afraid of anyone or anything, that's the Babylonians. They don't even fear kings. Kings have armies, but the Babylonians don't care about your armies. They just laugh in the face of opposing armies because their army is bigger, it's stronger, and more violent than your army. The Babylonians were incredibly violent, and they were a feared group of people that were quickly destroying and conquering the nations around them. And again, as you study history, you can see that through sheer force, the Babylonians were expanding their empire. And as quickly as they would wipe out a group of people, they moved on to the next one to conquer it. And this is crazy to me. But at the end of this incredibly terrifying description of the Babylonians, God says something important to Habakkuk. He says, these people, the Babylonians, they're guilty. They're not good people. They're guilty. You see, he knows that the Babylonians are guilty people. In spite of that, he says, I'm going to use them to punish you and to bring pain to you. I know they're not going to worship me. I know they're only going to worship themselves. They are guilty and they are evil. but I'm sending them to defeat you and to punish you. Now, doesn't that just seem strange? Habakkuk is crying out to God in frustration. God, this doesn't make sense. God, where are you? God, what are you waiting for? And God responds by saying, hey, I've got this under control. I'm actually going to send a people that are more evil than you that are going to punish you and defeat you. That just doesn't seem to make any sense. Have you ever asked a question and then you regretted asking that question immediately afterwards? I said this last week. I kind of think that's where Habakkuk's at. He asked this question. He had to have immediately, when he heard that response, thought, well, why did I ask that? God, where are you? And God says, well, Habakkuk, I'm right here, and I have a plan. It's not the kind of plan you're looking for. It's not the kind of plan that you were hoping for. It just doesn't seem fair, does it? It doesn't seem fair that God is doing this to the Israelites. You know, sometimes with my kids, I use the line my parents used on me, probably a line that your parents may have used on you, and maybe you use it today. Life isn't what? Life just isn't fair. There are moments when I tell my kids, hey, I'm sorry, but life isn't fair. And even though we use that line, even though we know deep down there are some things about life that really are not fair, we still get frustrated, don't we, when things are not fair. We want things to be fair. It should be fair. But when it's not, it's really, really frustrating. And God is using a pagan and a wicked people to punish the Israelites. And from Habakkuk's perspective, it just doesn't make sense. And he has to be asking this question, God, what are you doing? I cried out for help. And instead of answering my prayers the way I was hoping that you would answer my prayers, you're unleashing a wicked and evil people to bring about more chaos and to bring about more destruction. God, what are you doing? Have you ever prayed for God to do something in your life, and then the answer that you got was not what you were hoping for? Have you ever prayed and it seemed like God didn't answer? Or maybe the answer was the opposite of what you were hoping for. The question for us as we're reading through the end of chapter 1 is this: how do we respond, or how do you respond when God doesn't make sense? How do we respond when God doesn't make sense? When God answers your prayers in ways that don't make any sense to you, or when he allows you to experience pain, how do you respond? And again, I believe that we can look to Habakkuk for some answers. Habakkuk is asking all of these questions, but I want you to notice as we read through these next few verses, Habakkuk knows who God is. We kind of said this a little bit last week. Even though he's asking questions, Habakkuk has not lost faith in God. He doesn't understand all that's going on, but he still knows who God is. He's not lost sight of the reality of who God is, the truth about God. He's clearly not thrilled with the plan that God has shared with him, and he continues to ask God questions. But while Habakkuk doesn't understand God's plan, he is very clear about the character of God. I want you to look at it with me in verses 12 through 14, and we'll have it on the screen for you as well. He says, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You have made people like the fish in the sea, like the sea creatures that have no ruler. Can you see how even in the questioning, even though he doesn't understand what God is doing, notice that Habakkuk's foundation is still built on the character of God. His convictions about God guide him in his questions. The foundation of his life remains in what he knows to be true about God. Check this out. In verse 12, he says that God is eternal. He acknowledges that God is eternal. He knows that God is everlasting. He continues to believe that God always has been, that he always will be. He acknowledges the eternal nature of God. Lord, are you not from everlasting? He also recognizes that God is personal. He says, my God, my Holy One. See, he knows that God is not some being out in the universe that's just watching as we go through life, hoping that somehow we can figure this whole thing out, but that our God is a personal God that longs for intimacy and relationship with us. He walks with us through this life. He says, my God, my Holy One. And he identifies that God is holy. He calls him my Holy One, but he goes on in verse 13 to say, your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You see, God is light, and there is no darkness in him at all. There isn't anything shady about God. He is pure, he is holy, and he is righteous. He also says in verse 12 that God is sovereign. He says, you, Lord, have appointed them. You have ordained them. See, God is the King of kings. There is no one more powerful. His authority cannot be equaled. He is sovereign. And he acknowledges that God is the judge, that he is judge. God is the ultimate judge. He's the one who appoints those who will execute judgment to punish. He is the judge. Habakkuk knows that he doesn't have any right to judge, but God alone is the just God, the just judge. God is the one who can execute the right punishment and the right judgment. And then in verse 14, Habakkuk identifies God as creator. He says, God is creator. He says, you have made people. You know how we are. You know how we are created. You know what we're capable of. You know what sin has done to us. I know that you have created us, and you know that sin abounds. You know that people are not living in obedience to you, not living the life that you've created them to live. They are like, he says, they are like sea creatures without a ruler. They are doing what is right in their own eyes. So I think it's important for us to see that Habakkuk is questioning God. And we said last week, it's okay to question God. We should bring our questions to God. But even in the questioning, Habakkuk has not lost sight of who God is. He still believes. His faith remains in God. Even though he has doubts and he has questions, his faith remains in God. So even in his questioning, he knows the characteristics of God. He doesn't doubt who God is. He questions, God, if this is really who you are, if this is who you really are, then why are things the way they are? And sometimes we ask the same question. If you really are a good God, have you ever asked this? If you really are a good God, then why aren't you doing something about? And you can fill in the blank. And again, I believe that God can handle those questions. I believe that we should bring those frustrations to God. But here's where we need to be careful. Don't allow your experience to define God. Let God interpret your experiences. Let me say that again. Don't allow your experience to define God. Let God interpret your experiences. If we go through bad experiences in life and we allow those experiences to define God, we're projecting an image of God that is untrue. Instead, we need to allow the reality of who God is, the truth of the character of God, to interpret our experiences. I think most of us, we long to make sense of this life, right? I mean, there are a lot of things that I want to make sense of. And to do that, we really only have two options. We can either trust our own experiences, or we can choose to trust God. If you trust your own experiences, if you rely on your own perspective, if that's the foundation, if your feelings are the foundation that you use to make sense of everything, then it will follow that when things are good, then what? You're good. But when things are bad, then you're bad. And if you believe in God, but God, the truth about God, the character of God is not your foundation, then your view of God's going to be affected as well. When times are good, God is what? Good. But when times are bad, then, man, God must be really angry at me. God must be really an angry God, and he must be really angry at me. The other option is to understand, to build my life on this truth that God is my foundation. What I know to be true about God, the characteristics of God. God is your foundation around which all of life revolves. So that when life's going well, or when life's going badly, what you believe, how you act, the attitudes that you carry, the thoughts that you dwell on, everything is filtered through the character of God. It's not based on a feeling. It's not based on experience alone. My life experiences are filtered through what I know to be true about God. That's where Habakkuk was. Even though he's questioning God, he continues to remind himself of the character of God. He's like, I don't understand what I'm experiencing. I don't understand what you're doing, but I'm going to continue to cling to what I know to be true. God is eternal. God is personal. He is holy. He is sovereign. He is the ultimate judge, and he is the creator of all life. See, Habakkuk's foundation is centered on the character of God, and that allows him to endure and to keep his eyes on God. Regardless of the circumstances, he continues to trust that God has a plan and that God is good and that God's plan is ultimately for his own good. In fact, look at what Habakkuk says in chapter 2, verse 1. And we're going to dig into this a little bit more next week, but chapter 2, verse 1, he says, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. You see, Habakkuk, he climbs the watchtower and he kind of gets above it all to kind of get this new perspective, and he waits. You see, I just envision Habakkuk. He sets his eyes on God and he waits. Even though he doesn't understand, he continues to put his trust in God. So even though Habakkuk is wrestling through these questions, what are you doing, God? He continues to trust in the God that he knows. He continues to lean into his faith. He makes the decision to choose to trust God. It doesn't make that experience any less painful. It may not even make it make any more sense to Habakkuk, but he can trust what he knows about God. And he can trust that the hurt will ultimately bring healing because he knows who God is. See, sometimes God will allow us to endure some things that don't make any sense to us. But through those painful experiences, God can bring healing. I shared last week that Amanda and I experienced 7 years of infertility. And some of you know some of this story. There were so many nights that we prayed and cried and pleaded with God to bless us with a child. You know, it's like a lot of things in life. If you haven't been down that road of infertility, it's really hard for you to understand just how dark those days can be. Those were probably some of the darkest days of our lives together, and just struggling with this question, God, where are you at? Why aren't you answering our prayer? And I said this last week, friends got pregnant. I vividly remember our brothers' wives getting pregnant, and just, you're supposed to celebrate that, but we would go home and cry. Like, why not us? We had people that we knew that didn't even want kids, that were getting pregnant and having kids. And yet it just, from our perspective, it seemed like God didn't care. He certainly wasn't answering our prayers. And for 7 years, I felt like we cried out, God, where are you? What are you doing? And then after 7 years of praying and crying and attempting to understand what God was up to, he very, very clearly and he powerfully led us down the path to adoption. And I'll just preface this. I'm going to summarize this a little bit. But man, Amanda and I love to share that story of how God has worked in that and through that. And if you ever want to talk to us, feel free to stop us and have that conversation. We were blessed to be introduced to an incredibly strong young lady that made the incredibly difficult decision to place her child with us. And Amanda and I were able to actually be at the hospital when our first son, Jace, was born. It was one of the most amazing things we've ever been able to do. Amanda was actually in the delivery room. It was a really, really cool thing. I can't even begin to tell you how excited we were when that day came. We were overwhelmed with gratitude and joy and just praise. And I'll never forget holding Jace. I can still see it today. I'll never forget holding him in that hospital room just a few minutes after he was born and realizing just what a tremendous gift that he was. Praying for 7 years, and God finally answered our prayers. What we were unaware of when we brought him home was just how difficult the road was going to be ahead of us. We brought him home just a few days after he was born in March, and we continued to grow together as a family for the next 5 months. And it's a long story, and I'm going to kind of sum it up. But in August, we discovered that we were going to have to overcome some major obstacles to complete his adoption. To the point where we call it tummy mommy. If his tummy mommy changed her mind at any point during those 2 years, she could have came and got him. There wasn't a thing we could do about it. There was one point, even when we were meeting with our attorney, that he said, I was prepared to tell you that we can't win this case. Those are the kind of things that we were looking at. And I just remember when I got that news, I was devastated. Jace was sleeping, 5 months old, he was sleeping, and I got him up and woke him up, and I'm holding him, I'm crying. I laid him back down. I took a shower, and you want to talk about yelling at God? I was verbally yelling at God. Why on earth would you do that to us? Why would you bless us with this little guy and then take him away from us? I don't understand. God very clearly spoke to me in that moment. He actually had me go back and read the story of Abraham and Isaac. And I don't know if you've read through that story much. You know the story, God asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and he begins to take him up the mountain, and God provides a ram. At the end of that story, Abraham builds an altar, and he calls it, "The Lord will provide." And God spoke to me in that moment, much like this song we just sang. And he said, "I am the God of Jacob, and I am the God of Abraham. I'm the God of Isaac, and I'm your God. And you can trust me." It was a really scary, almost 2 years that we walked. But God remained faithful. Even in the unknown, even in the midst of those really difficult days, even when I did not understand what God was doing, God continued to remind me of who he was. He continued. There was a point when I very distinctly remember that same week we got the news of coming to an altar, and figuratively I laid Jace on that altar. And I said, "God, I'm going to trust you. If you choose to take him from us, I'm going to trust you. If you choose to bless us with him, I'm going to trust you." I made a decision to say, "God, I know who you are. And even if I don't understand what you're doing, I am going to choose to trust in who you are." And even though the circumstances around my life didn't seem to make any sense, I trusted God in that. We just chose to trust God in the unknown, in the uncertainty, in the questioning, and in the waiting. And I can tell you that through the struggle, through the pain, through all the hurt, my faith grew by leaps and bounds. Through those 2 years, I really learned what it meant to trust God. It's one thing to say that you trust God, and I thought I trusted God, but when you walk through something like that, you really learn how much you're choosing to trust God, right? I learned so much about how to trust God. When the world around me was screaming at me to doubt, to lose faith, I chose to embrace what I knew to be true about God. And God used my hurt to ultimately bring about healing. And what I've learned, and what Habakkuk reveals to us, is that there are plenty of times in this life when life doesn't make sense. I think we can all agree on that. There are even moments or seasons when God doesn't seem to make any sense. But as I said last week, we can choose to cling to God during those times, and we can allow those experiences to draw us closer to him, or we can allow those painful experiences to pull us away from God. That choice is ours. And I just believe that if you will choose to trust God, I just believe that if you will choose to cling to God during those seasons, that God is faithful, that he is good, that he does have a plan. And even when his plan doesn't make sense, you can trust his plan. You see, God has a perspective that's beyond my perspective. He knows things and sees things and understands things that I clearly do not. He is the creator. He is judge. He is sovereign. He is holy. He is personal. And he is eternal. And because of that, because I know that to be true, I can trust him.